So everyone should have gotten that recording message. We are recording this. And I'd like to welcome you all to the talk on alternative landscapes that benefit water quality. My name is Mara Roby. I work at Eastern Connecticut Conservation District. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about the grant funding that made this talk possible. So ECCD received grant funding wholly in part by EPA under an agreement to the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and Long Island Sound Future Fund grant. So we were very pleased to get that. Rain gardens to riparian buffers, pollinator pathways for healthy water is the name of the grant. So for those of you who haven't heard of ECCD, we are a nonprofit natural resource conservation organization. We service 36 municipalities in Eastern Connecticut, and we're one of 5 districts in the state. So some of the things that we do, we tend to focus a lot on water quality projects. So to that end, we write and implement grant projects, looking for solutions to reduce pollution. We write a number of watershed-based plans, doing some research and water quality collecting to write up those plans that have recommendations in them for reducing pollutants in a particular watershed. We also do lots of outreach to residents and towns and doing workshops such as this on natural resource concerns. And then we also are able to assist town land use commissions, and we provide technical assistance to residents. And we also assist farmers with natural resource concern assistance through NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Service, which is part of USDA. So in addition to our project partners, I'd like to thank very much the 5 towns and city that are involved in this project and for their participation and excitement and partnership. So that's the city and town of Groton, the towns of Preston, Ledyard, and Stonington. And then of course, the many, many, many volunteers that assist us planting rain gardens and riparian buffers. We certainly couldn't do it without our volunteers. So kudos to you guys. All right, so a little bit about the grant. The idea is to have multi-purpose benefits from installing rain gardens and riparian buffers. And that's for stormwater runoff capture. And it also benefits pollinators along their migration routes. There's a lot of additional benefits, but those are the main ones we're looking at. So the whole project is installing 5,000 square feet of riparian buffers and 20 rain gardens and mapping the pollinator pathways in the city and those towns that I mentioned. And also holding 5 rain garden and riparian buffer workshop work days, as well as 3 talks, which this is the 3rd talk. And then we are providing signage, 1 for each town, as well as numerous brochures on what folks can do to reduce non-point source pollution, some of the things that they can do in their own neighborhoods. So this project was started last June and will be ending at the end of this August, if all goes well. And the whys of the project are numerous. Here's a few: reducing stormwater runoff, as I've mentioned, providing flood control and recharging groundwater by keeping stormwater on site as much as possible. Lots of native plants can filter pollutants. And then also that great benefit of providing that critical pollinator food and habitat, especially with native plants. So I did mention a pollinator pathway, And I know probably a number of you do know about this, but if you don't, you could go to the website pollinator-pathway.org, and they have a wealth of amazing information all about this grassroots project. And so the idea, I think they started it about 6 years ago in the western part of the state, looking to really help those pollinators that are declining at a kind of an alarming rate. And so some of the things are looking at pesticide-free continuous corridors of native plants, or planting them. And definitely this will be food and habitat for those pollinating insects and hummingbirds. And these can be in sizes anywhere from small flower boxes in urban areas to curb strips to, people's yards or large green spaces. So really important. The Department of Agriculture talks about insects and other animals that pollinate 75% of the world's flowering plants and 35% or more of the food plants. This lovely medallion, hopefully your town, if they are on the pollinator pathway, has purchased these, and that's something that you can actually post in your yard if you choose to sign up and be on the pollinator pathway and take the pledge. So just to quickly, why this is happening. This is from the Pollinator Pathways website. There's definitely a few factors, and it has to do a lot with development, which causes fragmentation in the landscape. So those green spaces that have those nice native plants are become too far in between. And so pollinators looking and foraging for habitat and food, they just aren't able to, some of them don't go that far. So the other thing is there are declines in diversity and populations of native plant species. So a few benefits of the pollinator habitats, because there are many. When there's more pollinators, there's actually more birds. So almost 100% of songbirds need caterpillars to feed to the young. And then when you have more flowering plants, you're also going to have more seeds for birds and other wildlife. So folks that like to bird watch, in your yard, this is something to keep the birds around. And then of course, when you have more birds and other wildlife, things like bats and opossums can actually be eating those pests like mosquitoes. So really great benefits. And then lastly, just 4 actions that you can take. And so these are part of the Pollinator Pathway Pledge, these 3. They would like you to include native plants, flowers, shrubs, trees, and manage invasive species. Don't use pesticides or chemical fertilizers. And for spaces that have lawn, you might want to consider reducing your lawn and leaving some bare ground for the nesting native bees, as well as in the fall, leaving your leaves and spent stems, and that is a way for pollinators to overwinter. So if you are in one of these towns that the grant is under, then they will all have the pollinator pathways. If you are from another town, consider creating your own, starting your own. And actually there's some great instructions on the pollinator-pathway.org website for you to do that, if you would like. So I just wanted to give you that little bit of background, and I'm going to stop sharing and allow Lydia to share her slides. And in the meantime, I'm just gonna mention a couple of housekeeping things. So we're gonna have you save your questions until the end of the talk. If you need to, because you might forget your question, you can certainly put it in the chat, and we will be reading those at the end. Or at the end, you can raise your hand and go into reactions to do that. Hopefully folks know how to do that. Certainly can put something in the chat if you're having trouble. And lastly, just to remember to stay muted during the talk, and that will cut down on any background distractions. So I'm very pleased to introduce Lydia Pan, President of Wild Ones Mountain Laurel Chapter. Lydia, you can take it away.
Thanks so much, Maura. Can everybody see my screen? I guess I'll ask that to Maura and you can let me know if things are looking okay.
Looks good to me.
Great. All right. Well, Maura's already given a great introduction, but hopefully I will elaborate a little bit more on the points that she's mentioned and some additional ones. But she asked me to speak tonight about alternative landscapes that benefit water quality. So I've had the pleasure of associating with ECCD and learning about their work for about the last, I guess about 4 or 5 years. It started before COVID when a watershed survey was taking place in my town of Stonington. And I won't go into the details here, but it helped me to learn about the good work that ECC does and understand the intersection between what they are trying to do to help improve conservation of our natural management of our natural resources, and what I am spending a lot of my retirement doing now, which is learning about and advocating for the use of native plants in our landscaping. So fortunately, the two seem to really go hand in hand. And before I really dive into the talk tonight, where I'll try to make the connection between healthy yards and healthy water, I just wanted to acknowledge and thank my good friend Judy Preston, who some of you may know. She was the former outreach coordinator for the Long Island Save the Sound and the Connecticut Sea Grant. And she very kindly loaned me a number of the images and slides that I'll be using tonight. So, sorry, I just have to get to. All right. So, for the first time in history, gardens have taken on a role that transcends the gardener. This is a quote from entomologist and native plant evangelist, I'll call him, Douglas Tallamy, a professor at the University of Delaware, who really has written several popular books and does a lot of speaking himself, and is really pushing this idea that we are at a new stage in how we look at our landscapes. Landscapes used to be just for visual appeal. Now that we're learning, they can provide so much more. That's largely what I'll be talking about, is how we can really make our gardens and landscapes multifunctional. We don't have to really give up the visual appeal and the things we enjoy about them, but hopefully by making them more friendly to nature and by really using them to bring nature into our homes and support ecosystems at the same time, that it really will enrich our lives as well. Now, estuaries are in some regards can be thought of as gardens of the sea. These are the places where the fresh water meets the salt water along the coastline in somewhat protected and enclosed bodies like bays, coves, and inlets. And these are the kinds of habitat transition zones that are so rich in wildlife and in biodiversity. These are really, the estuaries are really nurseries for fish and wildlife along coastlines, which are responsible for 3/4 of our commercial fish catch, almost 90% of the recreational fish catch, a great deal of the blue commerce and the recreation we enjoy as beachgoers, boaters, anglers, nature lovers. And at the same time, the estuaries are so important for providing the ecosystem services such as filtering runoff waters, serving as buffers against storms along our coastlines, protecting our coastlines, and also serving as a nitrogen sink. There is so much life in the Long Island Sound. So talking about some of the biodiversity, these are some of the organisms that live in the water that many of you may or may not be aware of. We have anemones and corals, kelp, comb jellies and moon jellies. Eelgrass and kelp are very important vegetative components of the estuaries. And then the water is also teeming with microorganisms that you can't see without a microscope, but these plankton are food for many of the other critters that live in the sound. So in fact, Long Island Sound in 1987 was designated an estuary of international significance by Congress. It is a major economic driver of Connecticut's blue economy, contributing $7 billion a year to the region. And in 1922, a large portion of the sound, including parts of Fisher's Island Sound, the Lower Thames River and Lower Connecticut River, were designated the Connecticut National Estuarine Research Reserve. That's a mouthful, but it's only one of 30 such reserves in the nation. And that really recognizes its unique features not found in other estuarine reserves in the Northeast. The NERR designation recognizes the importance of an integrated and diverse mosaic of land and seascapes for a host of species, including many that are threatened or endangered. It has critical nesting sites and stopover grounds for migratory birds and is considered a wetlands of international importance. Now, the most recent report card for Long Island Sound is shown here, and it highlights the challenges that growing development poses to the sound. We have now 4 million people who call the coastline home, and 9 million people that live in the greater watershed of the sound. Water quality in the major basins is influenced by currents and the degree of ocean flushing. And if you look at the key on the left, it shows that green is the best and F is the worst as far as grades go. So it's pretty intuitive. And you can see that, again, those currents and flushing are responsible for the challenges, particularly to the innermost part of the Western Sound, where in past decades, excess nitrogen has created a hypoxic dead zone. And while this area still gets a poor grade, it has in fact improved somewhat. Although there are concerns that this recent improvement, the gains have largely plateaued or even beginning to regress due to rising water temperatures because of climate change, also continuing development that strains our wastewater management systems that are trying to keep up with this growing population. During the same time period, excuse me, there has been a decline, unfortunately, in the health of coves and embayments that are closer to the shoreline. The Unified Water Study was led by Dr. Jamie Vaudrey of UConn's Marine Sciences Division, and she enabled, by standardizing water quality measurement methodologies, she was able to compare the water quality at 53 sites across 40 bays along the Sound. And unfortunately, the results, which are shown in the little circles all along the coastline, indicate that 57% received grades of C, D, or F, which are not very good. And you can observe that many of the small bays and inner segments of larger embayments have poor tidal flushing, which is responsible for their difficulties in clearing themselves of local human source pollution from runoff flowing in from the rivers, streams, and groundwater. So I'd like to just show as an example, if you look to the far east end of the Sound, there is an orange circle, which marks Weckety-Quack Cove in Stonington. And some of its problems are very illustrative of the challenges faced by many of these smaller bodies of estuarine waters. So Inner Weckety-Quack Cove is impaired both as an aquatic habitat, as is impaired for its aquatic habitat, for recreation, and for the direct consumption of shellfish. Excess nutrients are degrading the water quality, and fecal bacteria and other potential pathogens make it unsafe for swimming and for direct shellfish consumption. The watershed survey I mentioned, participating in identified local sources of pollution that need to be addressed to improve the water quality in this cove. And those include pet waste, fertilizer, and poorly performing septic systems, as well as non-point source runoff from impervious surfaces and degraded riparian buffers. So it basically boils down to this key takeaway. If it goes in the ground, it goes in the sound. And this is because the entire state of Connecticut is part of the drainage that goes into all of the state drains into Long Island Sound through three major watersheds defined by the Housatonic River, Connecticut River, and Thames River and all their tributaries. These drain most of the inland portions of the state, and along the coast there are three estuarine zones that drain through other water bodies and smaller streams. Along the southwestern coast is one grouping, the south central coast, and then for those of us in the ECCD towns, we're mostly in the southeast coast. And along the border with Rhode Island, there's also the Pawcatuck River watershed that drains into the Sound. So a healthy watershed would mean a healthy Long Island Sound. And you can see, another type of map on the left here showing all of those streams and tributaries that flow into the rivers that all ultimately flow into the Sound. And the challenge is the size of the Long Island Sound watershed. Not only is Connecticut part of that watershed, but parts of 6 other states, given that the Connecticut River actually originates in Canada. So we're talking about 2 countries and 6 states that need to work together to actually manage water quality in the Sound. In order to understand how human activity impacts water quality, I'd like to first go over something that's pretty elementary that maybe we learned in school and maybe forgot. And this is the water cycle, the normal hydrologic cycle. So before development, most of the rain and snow, the precipitation that falls and lands on the ground, either is absorbed by vegetation or infiltrates into the ground. There's less than 1% of it that actually runs off directly back into receiving waters. Up to 50% of that water actually returns to the atmosphere through evaporation or transpiration by plants. So they return it back, and they, as we'll talk about later, do a lot to actually remove pollutants from that water. Some of which they use as nutrients and other which they simply absorb in their tissues. Much of the rest of the water is slowly filtered through the ground, either in the shallow zones called the interflow zone, or it percolates deeper into the saturated zone of below the water table, and then joins groundwater, which eventually then returns to the receiving bodies. And these various routes of slow water infiltration and slow flow allow that water to be largely cleaned. But once the impact of urban and suburban development is to disrupt a number of these processes. So what development does is it replaces a lot of the vegetation with our built structures. We remove forest canopy and replace it with our roads, parking lots, driveways, homes, patios, and pools, mostly impervious surface, even lawn grass, which is relatively poor at managing runoff. So we have an impact on the watersheds and receiving streams, because now the water running off our built environments is more likely to flow more quickly toward those receiving bodies, and to also be less, and because it's flowing more quickly, there's less time for the pollutants to be removed and less time for that water to infiltrate into the ground where it can be cleansed. Because we've cut down a lot of the trees and replaced a lot of the vegetation, there is less water that returns through the evapotranspirative processes. And interflow may be highly variable depending on the degree of development, soil compaction, and amount of impervious surface. And one can imagine during extreme events, there is more flooding and erosion that happens because of the faster water flows. So every year, 8,800 tons of nitrogen enter Long Island Sound from stormwater runoff, and it originates in several different sources. So, as mentioned, from our sewage treatment plants, if flooding occurs or there are overflows, and as these plants age and are really taxed to their capacity to handle the inflows, from the chemicals and fertilizer we put on our lawns, from agricultural runoff, either fertilizer on cropland or manure produced by livestock, exhaust from diesel and gasoline powered cars actually produces a lot of nitrogen oxides, which are dissolved out of the air by rainwater, and they fall to the ground. Stormwater runoff coming from impervious surfaces can carry a lot of the oil, dirt, any garbage and any chemicals that are spilled onto those surfaces, picked up to the water and go straight into the storm drains. The nitrogen is a particular problem because excess nitrogen tends to encourage algal growth in the water. And these algal blooms can be so exuberant that when the algae actually then impede the sunlight entering the water, these mats of algae eventually die and they fall to the bottom. Their decomposition by bacteria consumes large amounts of oxygen. And this is what creates what we call the dead zones or hypoxia. And when the the levels of dissolved oxygen in water fall too low, then you get fish die-offs like the one shown in the lower right. Fortunately, we haven't seen any of these too frequently, but this is a risk of hypoxia. So the way that we can counter the storm runoff and better manage it in our developed areas is through a host of practices collectively called green infrastructure. And these attempt to restore or emulate the natural processes of the hydrologic cycle by providing the following functions: by facilitating the infiltration and filtration of stormwater runoff, or by storing it, or by promoting its evaporation and transpiration. So most green infrastructure is a combination of engineering and the use of plants to accomplish these purposes. Trees in particular are fantastic as parts of green infrastructure because they provide many ecosystem services, and because of their sheer mass and enormous root zones. So a single tree a mature oak can absorb up to 100 gallons of water in a day. And by transpiring it provides cooling, and as well as many ecosystem services as a native tree, supporting lots of pollinators and caterpillars, other insect hosts. So both habitat and food. So alternatives to impervious pavement one is illustrated here, and there are many different types of permeable pavers or blocks that can be used as the base of driveways or patios that will allow water to infiltrate relatively well. And the nice thing about ones like the type of block shown here is there's enough gaps and soil space within and around the blocks to allow for planting. So it actually allows that driveway to double as a green space with little low-growing ground covers like clovers and violets that have the benefit of barely needing to be mowed. So they're actually relatively low maintenance. Other forms of green stormwater infrastructure include rain gardens, and in more urban areas where there may not be room for a rain garden, a stormwater planter. So rain gardens essentially are shallow basins that are planted that collect stormwater runoff from roofs and impervious surfaces in our residential areas, and let that infiltrate through the ground. And again, part of it is returned by the plants, and part of it will then filter through the ground before it reaches our waterways. Stormwater planters are kind of smaller versions in that runoff through gutters can be diverted into the planter, where it is both taken up by the plants and also filters through the soil matrix before perhaps running out of the bottom. The excess runs out from the bottom of the planter, but is much cleaner than when it went in. Rainwater can also be harvested and stored, and the simplest way of doing that is with rain barrels. A typical rain barrel will hold 50 to 60 gallons, like the one shown here. They can be chained together, and both the harvesting of the rainwater can then be used to water gardens or lawns or even house plants. And in fact, for people who have wells as their water sources, rainwater is actually higher quality because it tends to have rather low dissolved salts. So it's actually much better for the plants. And in urban areas, another form of green infrastructure is the tree box filter. And this does two things. It actually collects and helps stormwater runoff to be filtered through the roots of the tree, and it brings more water to that tree. One often sees these street trees confined to these little tiny concrete boxes, and I for one wonder how they get sufficient water to survive, but they manage. But trees that are planted in tree box filters do an even better job. And there's more information about all of these methodologies on the website called Connecticut NEMO, which is shown at the bottom of your screen. So if you want to know how large a rain garden you need, or how to actually build one for yourself, you can find that kind of information there. So there's lots of useful information for both homeowners and municipalities to know the different types of stormwater infrastructure they can use. So Maura mentioned riparian buffers. So any landowners or property owners whose land includes the shoreline of a stream, river, lake, or pond needs to be concerned about the types of vegetation that protect those bodies of water. Stream banks and shores that lack protective vegetation are prone to erosion and the entry of polluted runoff. Sometimes what has historically been planted are ornamentals that have now escaped and become invasive. So plants like Japanese knotweed or multiflora rose may look like they're forming a dense vegetative cover on the stream bank, but they are actually relatively poor as riparian buffers, because while they cast a lot of shade, their root structures are not very deep and not very dense. And these types of invasive plants also tend to preclude, they're kind of bullies. So they displace other plants, and they don't encourage the kind of dense vegetation that actually serves as a much better riparian buffer. So what you want are plantings that have dense root systems. And the way to achieve dense root systems is to have actually many different kinds of plants interplanted, including trees, shrubs, grass-like plants along waterways. That's often sedges, which are many species are very water-loving. And these some have very deep roots, some have broader root systems, but all quite dense. And collectively, they can filter a tremendous volume of water. These mixed buffers of native vegetation do the best job of slowing and cleansing water, and as has been discussed, they provide additional ecosystem services, providing habitat and food for the aquatic wildlife. So this talk was entitled Alternative Landscapes, and I haven't really said directly yet, alternative to what? Well, it's alternative to the default American landscape, which is still the lawn, that lush and neatly manicured green swath that upwardly mobile citizens aspire to or are forced to adopt in some cases by conformist homeowner associations. By most estimates, turfgrass is the largest agricultural crop in the lower 48, covering an estimated 50 million acres, which to appreciate, that's an area about the size of New England. 75% of that turf is actually in residential lawns. And I was interested to see on this map that unfortunately states like Connecticut in southern New England are in a region that shows the highest percent land conversion to lawn in recent years. But lawns, unfortunately, are one of the poorest forms of landscaping for managing water quality. Which is not mentioned, which isn't even considering the fact that these lawns are consuming huge quantities of natural resources. They require more equipment, labor, fuel, and use more agricultural toxins than industrial farming, which might be hard to believe, but apparently that's true, making them the largest agricultural sector in the US. Turfgrass industry is a $60 billion a year business, including both lawn care products and lawn care services. Besides being overly expensive, lawns are incredibly time consuming for many Americans who spend more than 3 million hours per year mowing them or weeding them. The 50 million acres of lawn in the US require trillions of gallons of water, 200 million gallons of gas to mow them, 90 million pounds of fertilizer, and 70 million pounds of pesticide, much of which goes into our water systems. Fortunately, there are better ways to manage lawns. So more sustainable practices of lawn care include selecting grasses that are best suited to your growing conditions and intended use. And what I mean by that are whether you have shade or sun, and depending on the region of the country. So in the Northeast, there are mixes of fine fescues or fescues and clover that, while perhaps not native, are still somewhat hardier and more drought tolerant than grasses like Kentucky bluegrass. For healthier lawns, mowing higher and less frequently is recommended. Leaving more grass on the lawn, more green, allows it to absorb more water and develop a better root system. Also, watering practices that water less often but more deeply and during the hot season are conducted either overnight or in the early morning hours. Conserves water. Mulching grass clippings reduces the need for fertilizer. You know, why cut the grass and take all that good organic matter away? And of course, one should not use more fertilizer than needed, but there's really no way to know how much fertilizer is needed without getting a soil test. So that's what is recommended, is get a soil test to tell you what types and amounts of fertilizer that are needed. And this can be done either through the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station in Hamden or at any Yukon Extension Center office. They have information and can tell you how and where to submit your soil samples. Fertilizer application should be limited to 1 or possibly 2 times a year. The best practice is really only to apply in the early fall when the lawn is actively growing. And one might consider what's called a freedom lawn, which is basically to say what's green is free to grow, and I just mow it when I need it and not too many times in the year. One can also consider native lawn substitutes, short native grasses or sedges, things like poverty oatgrass or purple lovegrass or eastern, some of the gamma grasses have different textures and heights. Some are suited for dry soils and some for moisture soils. Some are better suited for sun and for shade. So there are different options that are being tested as possible lawn substitutes. The main challenge so far has been to find these native grasses and sedges that can take the kind of foot traffic that some of us require. However, many of these can be mowed and from a distance are quite acceptable, visually speaking, as lawn substitutes. Recently, the Mount Cuba Center in Delaware completed a 4-year trial evaluating a large number of native sedges for garden use. And so you can find the results of that report online if that is something you're willing to consider. Pesticide use on lawns also needs to be reconsidered. And the kind of cognitive dissonance is shown by these two side-by-sides here, where the pesticide companies would like us to believe that we're getting rid of the pests, but it's perfectly safe. Nevertheless, they put up the little yellow signs that notify us that the pesticides have been applied and that maybe we should keep our children and pets off. And unfortunately, a lot of other forms of life are not able to read these signs and they don't know to keep off. Furthermore, I mean, it really makes you think twice about what are these poisons really doing. Most of the chemical pesticides are non-selective, so they really are what we call broad spectrum. So if they're an insecticide, they kill almost any kind of insect, not just the target species. That might be the mosquitoes or the grubs that are turning patches of lawn brown. There are alternatives that are less toxic. There are biological agents like milky spore or Bacillus thuringiensis, which are, as I said, these are bacterial agents that are reasonably selective for a subset of insects, in this case, grubs, of Japanese beetles and related species. There is a type of beneficial nematode that can be purchased and watered into your lawn. And these are soil developing little worms that parasitize the grubs and not much else. So they're really quite benign to the beneficial insects. For weed control, it's a little more challenging. Some promise has been shown by organic agents such as corn gluten products. Here, the cautionary note is these are pre-emergent weed killers, so they won't kill existing weeds. Also, one cannot use any corn gluten, but has to use specific corn gluten products that have been developed as weed killers. These tend to have very high protein content. They are also, unfortunately, more expensive, but have been shown to have reasonably good prevention of weed development. They don't prevent germination per se, but they kill weed seedlings when they're very small. In addition, as the corn gluten breaks down, it provides some nutrients to the lawn. So in fact, it has a kind of a fertilizer component to it as well. Alternatively, one may choose to kill weeds with organic agents such as vinegar or limonene-based organic herbicides, which can be sprayed onto existing weeds. These do not necessarily kill root systems, but they're reasonably effective at your average lawn weeds like dandelions. Slugs can be trapped with beer or deterred with iron phosphate pellets or fatty acid products derived from coconuts. And people who want to eliminate mosquitoes really should not resort to spraying. It's not terribly effective, as well as being non-selectively toxic to other insects. The key is to eliminate standing water sources where mosquitoes breed, or by using mosquito dunks, which have been proven safe in bird baths. And these dunks contain, again, certain types of bacteria that rather selectively kill mosquitoes and flies, but not other types of insects, and they're harmless to birds. For repelling mosquitoes at parties or lawn events that you may be holding, it's recommended to use oscillating fans or mosquito repellents. There are many pleasant smelling ones that are herbally derived. So mints and citronella, lavender and rosemary all have some degree of mosquito repellency, and these are quite innocuous. And another thing to consider, of course, is simply an enclosed sort of tented area with mosquito netting. But all of these poisons, including rodenticides. So rodenticides are another issue, and it's better to, well, again, think twice, because rodents that are killed by these poisons can be eaten by other animals, and which subsequently become victims of that poison as well. So a bird or a fox or a coyote that finds a dead rodent that has succumbed to poison will be taking in those toxins as well. So the problem with our beautiful lawns is they really provide no food and no habitat for insects, pollinators, or any other kind of wildlife. They produce no seeds, no nectar or fruit. So really they are deserts, and that's not even considering that if we put poisons on them, that they become toxic deserts. In addition to lawns, what most homeowners plant in their landscapes is for ornamental purposes or to occasionally fulfill other human needs, like planting a privacy screen. But if we are a little more thoughtful, we can fill our landscapes with plants that do much more for both us and for the environment and for wildlife. These native plants are much better at moving energy through the ecosystem, sequestering carbon, cleaning and managing our waters, enriching the soil, and supporting the wildlife and pollinators that we care about. They also provide greater resilience against climate change. We can transform our landscapes from being net consumers of resources to becoming net producers, contributing to our health and the health of the environment. And so this is largely by, as I say, reducing lawn and replacing it with other forms of planting. Many people, when they think about native plants, think of meadows of somewhat wild and weedy looking landscapes, and this is not necessarily the case. Native plants can be used in almost any form of landscaping, formal or informal. And while they may be a little bit more variable in appearance than the more conventional plants that are sold as lawn ornamentals or as landscape ornamentals, there are some, applying good landscape design practices basically can give you, a beautiful landscape. If you want to consider reducing your lawn, think about how much lawn you really need and what do you use it for. If it is needed as a play area for children or as an area for your pets to get their exercise, or if you simply wanted a secluded place to sit around a fire pit or to enjoy watching the wildlife in your gardens. You can signal intent with clean edges by including some built structures like fences or trellises or gateways, arches, designed groupings. As I say, it needn't be weedy or messy. It depends on the plants you choose to use and how you maintain them. And what's important about native plants is really in their roots. So here you can see clearly what makes turf, even a fescue turf, so poor at managing stormwater runoff. It really hardly has any roots in the soil zone. And many of our popular ornamental plants, non-natives like daylilies, spireas, or even ornamental grasses, have relatively shallow and horizontal root systems. So it both limits the density at which you can plant these types of plants, and it also does not allow you to create the deep root zone plantings that natives provide. So those natives require less water when they're established. Their deep roots are much better at preventing erosion and absorbing runoff. And importantly, they create an environment within the soil that is more harmonious with the ecosystems of our area, the natural ecosystems. And that's because soil is much more than dirt. Soil is alive, and there are more microorganisms in a teaspoon of healthy soil than there are people on the earth, according to the NRCS. Soil contains billions of bacteria, algae, microscopic worms, arthropods, fungi, and more. Collectively, the greatest concentration of biomass anywhere on the planet. These microbes are responsible for processing organic matter into rich, dark, stable humus, recycling nutrients into the soil. Plant growth is interdependent with this complex web of living things in the soil, which organize themselves around the plant roots. This is the so-called rhizosphere. So this is why we don't really want to disturb the soil any more than we have to, and why, while best practices tend to favor non-till or no-till mechanisms of planting. We want, because disturbance of the topsoil not only destroys these microbial colonies, but it incurs topsoil loss and stirs up the seed bank, often resulting in the establishment of invasive and non-native weeds. So it's best to keep living roots in the soil to deter unwanted plants, and to cover the soil with plants and plant residue. Plant residue meaning the leaves, the clippings, the duff that the plants produce. So they're basically keeping that recycling loop short, and you're allowing all of these organic components to return to the soil, literally return to the soil from whence they came. Healthy soils don't need fertilizer, and that's why, because you're allowing all of the organic material to recycle. And in fact, over-fertilizing gardens tends to favor the faster growing weeds. Native plants are diverse and beautiful. We have more than 1,700 species of plants that are considered native to Connecticut, that are functioning in our ecosystems. And these include trees and shrubs, iconic plants like the witch hazel, beautiful shrubs like native deciduous azaleas, winterberries and viburnums that produce colorful fruits, which are also highly desired by birds and used to fuel their migrations. There are important fall blooming, there are wildflowers that bloom throughout the season, but those that bloom in the fall are especially important for the migrating insects and birds to fuel their migrations. And there are ground covers, things like the foam flower. So several hundred of these 1,700 native species are nursery propagated and available for purchase. So it goes without saying that one should not dig wild plants to create a native garden. unless they are being slated for destruction by development and one gets permission to do so. I also want to mention that one should be leery of cultivars. These are named versions of plants, including native plants, but these are selections or hybrids that have been bred by humans for traits that we wish to propagate, not necessarily ones that serve the ecosystem well. Some of these cultivars, in fact, have altered or lost ecosystem function and lack genetic diversity, because they're being propagated vegetatively to preserve those traits for which they were selected. So again, they represent human biases, and in current nursery practice, there is really not a good way of knowing, other than your own observations, whether pollinators or birds can actually use them. And that can even be misleading. One story is with hybrid lobelias. So there are two popular types of hybrid lobelia, which is a type of popular wildflower, a red one, which is pollinated by hummingbirds, and a blue one that is pollinated by bees. Well, horticulturists have bred the red and the blue species to develop hybrids, some of whom kind of look like the red native, the cardinal flower, and they are sought out by hummingbirds. But it turns out these hybrids no longer have the high amounts of nectar that the native cardinal flowers do. They have the smaller amount of nectar that the blue lobelia parent typically provides for bees. So this mixed up hybrid is attracting hummingbirds, but not providing the amount of nectar reward that their native plants do. So this is kind of a cautionary tale. While it has not been proven, common sense would tell you that hummingbirds are not going to fare as well on a diet of hybrids, where they get relatively little energy reward for the amount they expend foraging. So what really makes natives better than non-natives and better than cultivars are the complex relationships that they have developed with the other species in the ecosystem over hundreds and thousands of years of co-evolution, which are this really delicate dance that refine the relationships and communication between the species. These plants provide critical resources to animals, the right kind and the right time. Many of the plants also depend on animals for their pollination and seed dispersal. So this mutualism allows them to continue evolving and adapting to each other together, even as the environment changes. One good example and an important group of pollinators are our native bees, not the farmed exotic honeybees, but the 300 plus species of native bees found in Connecticut alone. And this is of the 4,000 species of native bees that are found across the US, but we have about 300 or more of them in Connecticut. These native bees, unlike honeybees, are mostly solitary dwellers, and many of them are actually pollen specialists, meaning they emerge in synchrony with the blooming of particular flowers, which are the ones where they collect pollen in order to provision their nests and their future progeny. So their timing of their life cycle is really tightly interwoven with the plants that they feed upon. And oftentimes they do not travel very far to find their plants. So they really have to be together in the ecosystem. We're only beginning to understand some of these special relationships, and the inset here shows you another example, which is the left is what we see, a yellow coneflower, a yellow rudbeckia, but the right is an image taken under an an ultraviolet lamp, which shows you what a bee may see. So they can see wavelengths that the human eye cannot. And some of these, what shows up as red in this picture are the so-called nectar guides that are really signs pointing to a flower that is a good source of food for these bees. So when we breed cultivars, how do we know whether the nectar guides are still present or not? So without, and it really is a chicken and egg sort of thing, where without the specialist bees, which depend on specific plants, just as the plants depend on them for their pollination, if one or the other begin to disappear because they've been destroyed by development or displaced by invasive plants, holes are left in the landscape and the whole ecosystem becomes more depauperate. And such ecosystems that lose diversity become less resilient because there are less options, there are less choices for plants and animals as the climate changes or as growing conditions change around them. Now, not all plants are created equal. There are about 5% of native species that actually are responsible for making 75% of the food that drives our food webs. These plants are known as keystone plants, and the number one is shown in the photo here, the white oak. White oaks are considered the top, one of our top keystone plants because they serve as hosts for greater than 500 different species of caterpillars, the larvae of butterflies and moths, which are a very key food for nesting birds in the springtime. These birds must feed, even if they feed on seeds during other parts of the season, they need the rich protein source of these soft, squishy caterpillars and other larvae to feed their young. Oaks also produce abundant crops of acorns, which are important fall foods, again, for certain kinds of insects, for weevils and for ants, but also for blue jays, squirrels, deer, many different animal species. Not all keystones are trees, although many of them are. Some herbaceous plants are also considered keystone, such as a number of goldenrod and aster species, which again play host to many different insects in addition to providing nutritious nectar, pollen, and then seeds for birds. And many insects will also overwinter in the stems of these plants. So an important principle of sustainable landscaping is to accept the environmental constraints of your site, putting the right plant in the right place. There are native species adapted to a wide variety of soil, light, and water conditions. So know what you have on your property and don't fight it, work with it. There are beautiful native plant communities to fill wooded areas or meadows or sandy coastlines, all of these quintessential habitats to our region. Putting the right plants in the right place means fewer inputs are required because these are plants that are adapted to our native soils, which may be relatively rocky, gravelly, or infertile, but that's all right. The native plants are used to this and they've evolved in these places. The only time they need a little bit of extra TLC is possibly in the first season of planting, where like any plant, some supplemental watering may be required to help the plants become established. If we are gardening to support native pollinators and other wildlife, we need to provide suitable places for them to live and reproduce, as well as food sources in our landscapes. Continuing with this focus on native bees, as I mentioned, most are solitary and some forage only short distances from their nests. Their life cycles may be synchronized with particular plants, by and large, these bees do not sting, so we need not fear them, or so we can welcome them to our yards and gardens. 25% of them nest in cavities, and these could be rock piles or wood or any open hole of the appropriate size. The other 75% live in the soil, usually loose soil that's sandy or loamy. And one may see in the springtime these slightly larger holes and hillocks in your gardens or even in your lawns that maybe resemble anthills, but in fact are being produced by nesting bees, wasps, and other insects. The ground nesting bees actually produce, they create these substantial burrows, and each side chamber, they'll lay an egg and provision with pollen and food for their future young. So one should leave some of these spots in the garden, and it may be in the border between a lawn or garden bed and a sidewalk, or it can simply be, not being too meticulous about little sandy patches and other places in the garden. Don't be compelled to cover everything with mulch. As a garden friend told me one time, I didn't become a gardener to spread mulch. You can also create habitat by leaving some larger pieces of wood, dead tree branches, segments, turn them into decorative items in your garden, or simply hide them. These are important habitats for our native insects. So you can incorporate them into your garden design or make a dedicated space for them. These kind of scattered, more natural nest sites are maybe considered superior to the nesting boxes or bee boxes that you may see for sale, or that are filled with nesting tubes. While they may be used by some bees, others are more territorial and don't like such dense communities. The high density of nesting tubes also may promote the transmission of disease. Some bees nest in hollow stems, while others, like small carpenter bees, may actually drill into pithy stems and make their own chambers within them. Many of these insects overwinter in dead stems, either as adults or their pupae will overwinter. And that's why it is generally advised by the Xerces Society and other conservation-minded groups to leave the stems and leave the leaves in the fall and the stems standing in your garden. It's generally advised that you can cut them back sometime in the spring to a height of maybe 12 or 18 inches. And this continues to provide nesting sites for the next generation of bees after they emerge, forage, and begin provisioning their nests for the next cycle of reproduction. It's one of the most frequent questions I am asked is, well, when is it safe to cut down these stems in the spring? So when our fingers are itching to make our gardens tidy and to clean up, is it okay to cut the stems? It's always a bit of a compromise. The Xerces Society considers it ideal to leave the dead stems standing pretty much for as long as until they naturally decompose, which is about 2 years, because different species of insects will use them at different times of year. The longer you can hold off cutting them down and removing them from your garden, the better for the insects. But that's really a negotiation between the garden decorator and the conservation gardener to decide. Again, you may, compromise and make the more visible parts of your garden look a little tidier, and bundle up these cut stems and leave a pile in a less, visible portion of the yard. What I've found is also that leaving some of these taller stems while the new growth is beginning to come up actually helps to protect some of my herbaceous perennials from springtime browsing by deer. So I found that to be a side benefit of leaving the stems. And as I mentioned, leaving some of this vegetation throughout the winter and throughout the seasons provides habitat and in fact provides beauty. It's a different type of beauty in the garden, but one that we can learn to appreciate. So these grass clumps, flower seed heads provide both food and shelter for wildlife. The seeds and the insects that the seed heads and vegetation harbor are winter food for birds. You may observe them not only coming to your feeders, but searching through, tossing leaves and searching through the litter for morsels to eat. Now, ecological landscaping benefits people as well as wildlife. As I mentioned, native gardens can be beautiful. They tend to be lower in maintenance once established in particular, because if you do put the right plants in the right place, they require fewer inputs. You may do a little bit of what we call editing, which is if they are seedy and you plant spring up, well, just remove or pot up those extras you don't want. Native landscapes are water conserving. Again, well-adapted plants with deep root systems need very little irrigation, except perhaps during extreme droughts. They're healthy for people and animals when you don't have to put a lot of chemicals and pesticides on your garden. These plants create climate resilience, a greater amount of vegetation, helps to cool properties, especially developed areas. Trees provide shade, but also just the transpiration provides a cooling effect from otherwise paved heat islands. And these can also give us a sense of place. I mean, what is more iconic than the blazing red of a sugar maple in the fall, or stands of Joe pieweed, or even goldenrods? If you take we can use ecological landscaping as a tool to help us better live in our environments. It's not really a solution, but it is an important tool. It's also a way to help us relax and become more integrated, to not think of nature as something over there, but something that we are really part of. And to relax the must feed, kill, cut, mow, blow, neaten, and water all season thinking that is so prevalent in conventional gardening practices. In 1974, Margaret Mead warned, "We are living beyond our means. As a people, we have developed a lifestyle that is draining the earth of its priceless and irreplaceable resources without regard for the future of our children and people all around the world." So if we take a step towards sustainable gardening, something that each of us can do, we actually do more by doing less, in working with nature and not against her. By taking care of the earth, we also take care of ourselves. It's encouraging that there are signs that change is actually happening in attitudes. The popularity in this inset of a public park called the High Line in New York City. It's a 1.5 mile long elevated park and greenway that was planted with largely native plants along an abandoned freight rail line above the city streets. And both humans and wildlife have flocked to it. One can find monarch butterflies and caterpillars and other insects and birds. In an urban environment full of skyscrapers like New York. The Pollinator Pathway Project is another example of changing attitudes. Doug Tallamy's Homegrown National Park, where he invokes each of us to turn our own property into our own little national park, to invite the wildlife back in, to accept different styles of landscaping in our urban and suburban environments, are all indicative of a growing desire to live in harmony with nature. The organization that I work with a great deal, Wild Ones, has environmental lawyers who advise members on how to engage with the weed police or homeowners associations around better landscape choices. And residents of some towns in Connecticut and Massachusetts have recently organized to work with their local governments on regulations and ordinances that not only that actually encourage the use of more native plants in the landscaping and incentivize them. What we do in our yards extends beyond our yard. If we nurture the health of our landscapes, it benefits many life forms, both those living in it and those living downstream. So we can make healthy landscapes in our yard, but also improve the health of those gardens of the sea. And I'd like to close just with a quote from a writer and columnist whose writing I enjoy very much. These are the words of Margaret Renkel, an American writer who contributes weekly opinion columns for the New York Times. She says, I can remind myself all day long, every day, that there's a difference between doing something and doing nothing. That something, small as it might seem, is not nothing. The space between them is far apart, limitless, stretching distances apart. It's the difference between a heartbeat and silence. So we can all do something. And I just want to say thank you for your attention this evening and invite any questions. I've put the contact information here into the chat, so you can save the chat to your own computer and go look for resources if you're interested in learning more about gardening with native plants or about our organization. We do educational programs. We're based right in southeastern Connecticut at Connecticut College Arboretum. And if you want to learn more about us, you can subscribe to our listserv, and we will send you monthly email announcements about our activities and also other upcoming events of interest in our area. So I'll stop my screen sharing now so we can have some questions.
And I am trying to put us into the right mode here so that everybody can see everybody.
Yep, I actually am not seeing anything in the chat. So if you have a question, feel free to unmute yourself or raise your hand using the reaction button at the bottom of your screen, and Maura or I can call on you. We're a pretty small group, so we can be very informal. And
so Lydia, you do have
yep,
question?
Sierra, do you want to unmute yourself?
Oh.
I think I am unmuted.
Sierra.
All right, I was just gonna ask about for use of like a pesticide in a natural solution. I heard cedar oil, like diluted cedar oil was a good substitute. Do you have any opinion or advice on the use of cedar oil?
So cedar oils have been historically used for repelling certain kinds of insects like moths, often cedar chests or, cedar linings to, your armoires and stuff. So I believe there is a basis for that. Although I would say that carpenter bees are very happy to nest in cedar. So it doesn't repel all insects. It kind of depends, I think, on what types of insects you're interested in repelling.
Ants, mosquitoes, ticks.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know all the details. But yes, it is considered relatively safe. I'll put it that way. You know, I can't really speak to the effectiveness myself. I would say there is no perfect solution for ticks except to know. I mean, I personally, what I do is I pull my socks over my pant legs when I go walking in tall grass or hiking. I will treat my clothes with permethrin, and use insect repellents that you are comfortable with. You can use organic ones, although conventional DEET, or what's the other one? There's another one that's quite popular, are quite effective against both mosquitoes and ticks. And since I do a lot of work trail clearing or in habitat restoration, I usually am very conscious of trying to protect myself. But at the end of the day, you just need to do tick checks and try to make sure, you know, that you don't have any on your body. It usually takes them at least a day to attach, so you do have some time. Charles,
So Char, oh,
yep.
I had a question about mugwort and whether that you have any effective ways of controlling it that aren't bad for the surrounding environment.
So the good news is I think the non-chemical methods are probably as good as the chemical ones in many cases, because single applications of glyphosate aren't really adequate. I'm doing a lot of work with mugwort at Coogan Farm, and so it ranges from, depending on are you dealing with a big infestation or kind of small amounts that may be popping up in your yard?
A big infestation.
Okay, so if it's really taken over an area, what you can do is you can mow it and either solarize or tarp it or smother it with a combination of cardboard and wood chip mulch. I can, if you want to contact me, I can send you some additional information, or I can just point you to if you're familiar with the CIPWG website, it's cipwg.uconn.edu. That stands for the Connecticut Invasive Plant Working Group. And a couple of symposia back, I think it was in 2020, Kathy Connolly and I both provided some handouts on the ways where we manage mugwort amongst other invasives in small areas. Well, when I say small, I mean kind of an acre or less. But I've done solarization quite successfully in sunny areas. So if you mow down the mugwort, then cover it with clear greenhouse plastic. I would use 4 or 6 mil plastic so it's quite sturdy and stays intact all season. You need to weight down the edges so that you want to basically seal those edges so that the greenhouse effect literally cooks all of the plant matter and even the top few inches of soil underneath the plastic. There has been some work done on this to document the temperatures achieved, and it's pretty impressive. So I would say solarization actually has some advantages if you're in a good location for it, meaning a location that is relatively flat and gets a lot of sun, in that it will also tend to sterilize that top seed bank. So then if you pull the plastic off at the end of the season and it looks like things are really dead, you can plant directly into the soil, again, trying to disturb it as little as possible. And, there should be relatively few weed seeds resprouting. You can also try smothering or tarping if you're in an area that's less ideal for solarizing. Again, one of the keys is just patience. These methods take time, but once you set them up, you don't have to do anything. Just leave it alone for a year, then come back and check the degree of kill that you've achieved. But all of those methods I mentioned have been pretty effective against mugwort.
Thank you.
Lydia, there was a question in the chat. Somebody wanted to know your favorite source of native plants.
Probably isn't one native source. What you do want is, ideally you want seed road plants. You want plants derived from our local ecotypes. So the best sources of those would include Earth Tones Nursery in Woodbury, Connecticut, the Native Plant Trust in Framingham, Massachusetts. They actually have 2 sites, both in Framingham and in Whatley, which is not too far from Springfield. There are seasonal plant sales, for example, by the Rhode Island Wild Plant Society. I think one of them just happened, but they have another one at the beginning of June. They grow most of their own plants from locally collected seed, so they're a great resource. There are some other nurseries listed on our Mountain Laurel Chapter website. If you look under the resources tab, there will be a number of nurseries and seasonal plant sales. I should mention Connecticut has the Ecotype Project, which was a collaboration between NOFA, the Connecticut Botanical Society, and what they're trying to, and plant nurseries in Connecticut. So they're trying to create this new supply chain of local ecotype plants. And many of their plants are now sold by retail nurseries, can order them from the primary grower, which is Planter's Choice. There's also a small urban nursery in New Haven called Urbanscapes, which is also selling the Ecotype Project plants. So that's a good source. Those are good sources. Hopefully I've given you some ideas, but please do look at our Mountain Laurel Chapter website. Cindy.
Hi. I was just curious with the changes that are occurring with warming. If I were trying to anticipate as I was choosing plants, would I look towards things that are doing well in New Jersey, or is there enough difference between northern Connecticut and the coast that I just kind of aim for things a little south?
So that's a really good point, and that's recognizing that our ecoregions are not static. And there are organizations that are trying to do assisted range expansion for some plants that maybe right now are barely getting into Connecticut at the northernmost end of their range. So Cindy, you could certainly try those that are, clearly doing very well in areas south of us. Whereas more boreal plants, where we may be at the extreme southern end of their range, are maybe not so good choices for the long run. It's hard to say, but that's a philosophy I have heard from people. And that's why even when I talk about natives, I think, you could argue there are the purists, there are people who use slightly different definitions, but I think if we're really focusing on ecological function, of course, the pollinators don't really know where our political boundaries are. So if a plant is found in New York and New Jersey, as even if it's technically not in Connecticut, well, if you look at the type of conditions under which that plant grows and it seems to suit your planting conditions, I'd give it a try. I think mid-Atlantic plants are probably reasonable choices. There's some really popular pollinator plants that are technically not native in that they don't have native wild populations, like Anise hyssop, which is a wonderful pollinator plant, but it is native to Eastern North America, but to states that are somewhat south and west of us. So, and I think the other thing to consider is, are you planting, what kind of setting are you planting in? Is it an ecological restoration on a preserve? There you might want to be a little more sensitive to the sourcing of your plants, to their ecotypes, and to their being true natives. Whereas if you're planting, a community pollinator garden or a garden in your own property, you might be a little more liberal. And it's also not to say that your garden has to contain only native plants. We only ask that you don't plant invasives, but if there are ornamentals that have cultural, sentimental significance, yes, grow your grandmother's peonies, or something that gives you joy. The gardens are for people as well as animals. We try to come to a good compromise.
Thanks.
All right. Well, if there aren't any more questions, we just went a little bit over, but I think we started a little late. So I just really want to thank Lydia. What a great talk. A lot of amazing information. I learned a lot. And I think everybody probably here did as well. So really appreciate you're doing the talk. And I just want to let people know I put ECCD's website in the chat, conserveconnecticut.org/Eastern. And I am going to put the recording there on the first page when I get it. And you can just scroll down. There's actually some information on that first page about this project, and I will put the recording link in there. So again, thank you all for attending, and happy planting.
Thanks, Maura. Keep up the great work. I really love ECCD and all that it does.
Thank you.